One of the biggest underappreciated elements of public transit is just how fast it goes. In places where transit is the fastest option, or at least competitive, it tends to be more popular, which is probably a big part of why these slow systems that predominate North American transit are so much less popular than their international counterparts. People have limited time, and the faster they can get to their destination, the less time that traveling takes up. If getting in a car means saving an hour or even half an hour, a lot of people are going to do that. One of the most important issues for speed and a perennial debate in the transit world is stop spacing. But how does the distance between stops impact how long it takes you to get to work on the bus? And what's the impact of this seemingly minor decision on transit systems? Let's talk about it. Hey, I'm Reese and this is RM Transit, a channel about rapid transit and how to make transit rapid. Consider supporting me on Patreon so I can keep making videos like this. If you want transit to be fast, there's various levers you can pull, but some are less available than others. You can try to increase the top speed of transit, but with many transit modes from buses to trams, your top speed is probably restricted to the top speed of the road that the vehicle runs on or around. You can try and reduce intersections where vehicles might have to stop, but this often isn't in control of the public transit company. And ultimately, road networks are always going to have intersections. You can try to go above or below intersections, but at some point the cost isn't worth it and you might as well be investing in a metro or subway system. These limited dimensions which transit systems can try to increase speeds is a big part of why removing stops so that vehicles literally spend more time moving and less time stop is such an attractive option. For one, it's under the control of the transit system, but it also usually isn't all that expensive. Now, adding and removing stops is a complicated science. Imagine a transit route along a street. Every time you add a stop, you increase the number of people who can easily get to that transit service. Well, the distance varies. For most people, a 10 minutes walking pace is about 800 meters, so most stops are going to attract most of their riders from within about 800 meters in all directions. Of course, that 800 meters isn't actually the distance as the crow flies, but the distance people are willing to walk to a stop, which means in practice it's usually shorter. And that's a big part of why the design of a street grid can have a huge impact on how far existing transit service actually reaches. While a certain type of planner might like a curvy cul-de-sac laden road layout in the suburbs, transit planners typically won't, because this means longer access times to transit and less transit ridership. In places where transit access is taken seriously in the suburbs, as well as walking and cycling, pedestrian access routes as well as cut-throughs are often provided so that even in suburban areas with kind of loopy road layouts, people have pretty direct access to main streets and transit. Now, since transit lines tend to be lines, where you place your next stop is really important. On one hand, since your bus or tram route most likely runs along a street, people can walk along that route to access the stops. And so if the goal were to be only covering the street that a transit vehicle runs on and the destinations along that street, then you really only need stops every 1.6 kilometers or so, which provides coverage to the entire street. That's because each stop can cover the street itself for 800 meters in either direction. This might work well in a city that only builds things on arterial streets, but if you live within a block, you're going to have to walk. A lot. And so transit stops tend to be a lot closer together to try to balance access to people on the street as well as to destinations off of it. But it's also worth remembering that the closer and closer your stops get to one another, the more and more of the actual area being covered by them is redundant. That means you're giving more and more people to closest stops and less people easy access to transit. This is the fundamental struggle of stop spacing. But you might say, the trade-off isn't just about how many stops you have, but also between the number of stops you have and the actual speed of a route. And on this you'd be right. Every time a vehicle stops, it increases the amount of time that a journey along a route's going to take. And what's not necessarily intuitive is that it doesn't take the same amount of time for the same number of people to board over more and more stops, because every time a vehicle stops it has to slow down, often pull over to the curb, and sometimes lower. And so each additional stop adds additional time, even if no one's getting on or off. That means that trying to get the same number of people to board through fewer stops is often going to save time and make journeys faster. So then, is it time to start removing stops shotgun style? Well, not quite. On any given route, stops tend to be placed for a variety of different reasons. from trying to balance coverage to trying to reduce the amount of time that vehicles are stopped for. A big reason that you so often see transit stops at intersections is that vehicles often already have to stop at intersections because of lights, especially if there's poor signal priority. And that means that you can use some of the time that vehicles are often going to be stopped anyways to get people on and off of the vehicle. The most successful stop removal programs typically try to remove the stops that are closest to others and least used. That way riders have an easy alternative option. Of course though, sometimes the best option is to remove a number of stops and then replace them with a different set of stops that better balances coverage. You might say, well, okay, you can remove a ton of stops, but that means that people have to walk way more to get to transit, so any time savings are moot. But this isn't really the case. For one, usually stop removal programs don't have the number of stops, and so increases in walking distance tend to be fairly modest. And of course, the more density you have along major streets, intersections, and near stops, the less this is going to have an impact on you because most people are living close to transit anyways. And on the other hand, removing a bunch of stops will speed up everyone's journeys. And that's really why the trade-off makes sense. Some people may have to walk a little further to transit, but they get their time back in faster transit down the line. And for everyone whose stops weren't removed, well, it's all upside for them. Stop removal and reduction programs usually result in a net benefit for riders, otherwise they wouldn't be done. Of course, when you remove stops, this can have an impact on people with limited mobility. But again, in most cases we aren't talking about a huge increase in distance. And in any case, the best solution for people who struggle to get to their stop is a paratransit service that can operate as a last mile solution both at the beginning and the end of a trip. There are, of course, other ways which you can reap many of the same benefits as stop removal programs using other levers. For example, express services which bypass stops can allow you to provide different levels of service along the same transit corridor. That gives you both the fine-grained stops of a local service and the speed of an express. When networks are designed as just that, networks, and people can easily transfer between services, they can get the best of both worlds. Hop on the local bus that stops just down the street and then hop off and back on to the express route to get across town quickly. But of course, like all things in transit, there's a trade-off here. If you operate a local and express service, that's going to require a lot more vehicles, especially if you want to maintain high frequencies. Something you might wonder is why transit agencies seem to be so keen on stop removal programs. I mean, besides the fact that they make routes faster. It's not like some manager at transit agency HQ gets to benefit from the exhilaration of hitting 50 kilometers per hour in a bus a little more often. As I already said, having a faster route does attract more riders, which is a big benefit to transit agencies, but there are other benefits as well. When a route runs faster, a transit agency can serve that route with less vehicles. Or, more importantly, use the same number of vehicles to provide a higher level of frequency, which attracts more riders and can attract more ridership and more funding for the transit agency. So often for transit systems, speed means being able to use the buses and trains they already have more effectively. As you might imagine, there is a North American angle here, and that's because stop spacing tends to be a pernicious and recurring problem for so many systems on that continent. You see, in Europe, bus stops tend to be spaced every 400 to 500 meters apart. But in North America, stop spacings for buses can get a lot closer together. And if you have bus stops every 100 meters, then you're going to have 4 times more bus stops than a system that has a bus stop every 400 meters. I talked about this in a previous video, but imagine how much nicer each of your bus stops could be if you had 1/4 as many. And having to maintain less stops and less shelters is probably another attractive feature for transit agencies. The outcome of this is that European transit tends to move faster, and bus stops tend to be so spaced out that they're often even visible on transit maps. What's crazy about this is that European cities should be able to afford having stops that are closer together than North American cities, because they just tend to be more compact and more dense. There's just going to be a lot more long journeys that people want to take in a typical North American city, because everything is so spread out. But why do systems in North America stop so much? I think it's for a lot of the same reasons that we struggle to build high-density housing. It's a sort of reverse NIMBYism. You see, often transit agencies in North America are very open to adding stops when they're requested, and they're also often quick to back down if someone, say, sends an angry letter when they suggest removing a stop that's out front of their house. But this is a tragedy of the common situation. It obviously doesn't hurt riders or a transit agency to have a single extra stop that's a little too tightly spaced. But once you scale that up to the size of a city and a lot of people are requesting extra stops, you get a slower, less efficient system. So why aren't European cities this way? Well, I think that when you actually move a ton of people on transit already, you're more willing to face these trade-offs. Sure, an extra stop might make it a little easier for some new riders to get on board, but it's also going to mean all of the existing riders have a slower trip. Given the fact that they tend to move so many more people, it's probably not surprising that the very well-used systems of Europe have erred on the side of efficiency, which North American systems just typically have not. As usual, the real differences in planning and policy have real differences on the outcomes we see. And as I've been saying, the trade-off between travel speed and the number of stops you have is critical but underappreciated. I often hear people say that we should add more and more stops because that will mean easy access for more people and obviously more ridership, but this isn't true. For one, as I've already discussed, there's a diminishing returns effect when you add more and more stops because more and more of that stop coverage zone is going to be redundant. But it's probably just as important to remember that as you add more stops, you make a route more slow, and as a route gets slower, it gets less attractive to riders all along it. When people have access to other options, be it a car or even a bike, if transit gets too slow or too infrequent, then people are just going to choose other options. And this is only going to be more the case in places where cars are plentiful and highways are as well. Slower transit doesn't just mean annoyed riders who will have to suck up a slower trip. Those riders will often choose a different mode of transportation that gets them to their destination more quickly. There's a real trade-off here. It's because of this that I think stop spacing discussions can't only consider the local impacts of slightly more or less coverage, but should also consider the impacts on people at the end of a route who might have a much longer trip if you add a ton of stops. It's because of this that I think stop spacing discussions can't just be about local area coverage along a line, but also have to consider the average speed of a line so that someone taking a longer trip can still find it to be a compelling option. By adding more stops, you put more destinations and people close to transit, but you also make transit slower. There's a balance that has to be sought. It should probably also be said that the average North American could probably benefit from walking a bit more. Of course, there are people who can't walk far at all, but in that case, distance isn't really a huge issue. It's the walking in the first place. For most people though, getting in a few extra steps every day is probably a good thing, and health statistics that you can look at comparing Europe, Asia, and North America typically back this up. I want to close with this graphic from Marco Kitty, which highlights the differences in stop spacing between Montreal and Grenoble. As you can see, in Montreal, you won't have to walk as far to your stop, but you're not actually getting anywhere faster because of those tighter stop spacings, vehicles run slower and the frequency of the network is lower. I think these slow and infrequent local buses are a big part of why cycling has probably become so popular in Montreal. People generally understand these days that if you want people to get on a bus, it has to be frequent. But we also need to realize that if we want buses to be frequent, they probably shouldn't stop at every corner. People intuitively understand that if transit doesn't have enough stops or stations, then people won't easily be able to use it. But we also have to remember that if transit has too many stops, then people might have better options. Thanks for watching.